Well, in terms of First Amendment law, anonymous speech is protected, but I don't think that's sufficient enough of an answer. And I tend to think of the justification for anonymity as like a seesaw. That essentially, if we lived in a free and enlightened society in which people welcomed dissent and welcomed disagreement, and there was no imaginable idea that you'd be punished for it, then the justification for anonymity would kind of fall on ring hollow to people. They'd be like, who cares? But we don't live in that world, and we live less in that world than we used to.
Greg, where does this podcast find you?
Maine, actually. This is my first day up here since last year.
First day up there. Where are you usually?
DC.
Oh, nice. So let's bust right into it. Give us your thoughts on cancel culture. How did it start? A brief history of it. And how does it differ from accountability, so to speak?
Sure. I mean, I wrote a book called Canceling of the American Mind with when I started the project, 20-year-old Ricky Schlott, who's absolutely brilliant, and I feel very lucky to work with her. And it definitely was one of those things that was a really striking discontinuity from the rest of my career. I started working defending free speech on campus in 2001. And back then, you were most likely to get in trouble on campus from administrators. Professors were fairly good on freedom of speech. Students were great on freedom of speech and freedom to differing opinions. But right around 2013, going into 2014, a cohort of students showed up that were much less, just to be blunt, tolerant of difference. That essentially you started seeing a lot more demands that speakers be canceled. You started seeing demands for new speech codes. And this was a big shift from what I'd seen before. But I also started seeing some of this happening off campus. So I try to define cancel culture as a historical period, because all moments in the history of censorship have commonalities, but they also have things that make them distinct. And I think one of the distinct characteristics of cancel culture is that it was essentially impossible to have it as we understood it without something like social media, something that allows you to create the reality or oftentimes appearance of a sudden mob that's demanding you fire that one employee. And this wasn't a subtle shift. I'd been doing this job for a long time prior to 2014. And from 2014 on, I've seen more professors lose their jobs, more tenured professors lose their job than, what I'd seen in my previous half of my career, times 20. It was really quite a shift. So the way that Ricky and I define cancel culture is the uptick of campaigns to get people fired, punished, penalized, expelled, or otherwise punished for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. There, I'm making an analogy to public employee law, which basically means that that there's some common sense injected in there, but that essentially you're not supposed to fire people just for their outside speech as a citizen, and the culture of fear that resulted from it. And one thing you should notice about that definition is there's no political valence to it. So cancel culture is cancel culture, whether it comes from the left or the right.
Isn't that one of the deltas, though, that there's always been shaming or criticism of people if they, if their narrative doesn't match yours, or an opportunity to play a gotcha culture. But what I see as the big difference over the last 10, 15 years is the discovery that you could go after people's livelihood. It used to be that was somewhat isolated. Like I don't like what Greg says. I'm going to publicly shame him. I'm angry at him. He's a bad person. You shouldn't be his friend. You shouldn't be listening to him. But it never jumped the shark to now go after his livelihood. Wasn't that the big difference here?
Well, that was part of the definition. Our campaigns to get people punished in some real material way, like get them fired, expelled, etc. It's not cancel culture if you're just telling it. There was a phenomenon called trashing in the 1960s that Musa Al-Gharbi likes to point to. And it's this really nasty, vitriolic way of going after political enemies that was everything you're talking about. It's like, this person's a bad person, don't listen to this person anymore. They're not, they're not doctrinaire as I would like to be doctrinaire. but it generally didn't get to the point of, and this professor has to be fired. And the biggest shift, the one that kind of shocked me, was the uptick in around 2017, because at first students were focusing on each other and outside speakers. But 2017 really marks the moment when they started going after professors in large number.
Talk a little bit about quote unquote deplatforming.
Deplatforming is just the idea, that essentially, the way we define deplatforming in our research department at Fire, is essentially getting a speaker, either getting them disinvited or making it so difficult to hear them, or otherwise chasing them off campus. The ones that scare me, the kind of deplatforming that actually scares me the most, are the ones that involve violence or the threat of violence for obvious reasons. It's primarily targeted at speakers. We also consider it deplatforming if you do the same thing to, like, say, playing a movie. That essentially you're showing a documentary that's not very popular on campus, students show up and shout it down. But this is actually one of the areas where a lot of it actually comes from the right as well, because for a lot of speakers on campus, there'll be off-campus pressure to get that person disinvited, and this is particularly true of, say, speakers that could be painted as like pro-choice, and sometimes Catholic groups. I think the Cardinal Newman Center is big on this. Pressure schools to disinvite that person. So generally, this is for fairly obvious reasons, if the threat to free speech and deplatforming comes from the left, it tends to come from on campus. If it comes from the right, it tends to come from off campus.
I saw some of this as a faculty member at NYU. I remember about 10, 15 years ago, it became sort of in vogue for department chairs to put out very long emails about how certain microaggressions would not be tolerated. And it was okay, we're charging kids $280,000 to come here. Some of them leave riddled in student debt. Two-thirds of the faculty probably isn't holding the weight. So there was an opportunity to step into this virtue circle, and no one could ever criticize them. I'd do anything but applaud. Otherwise, you were a racist. And there was almost this sort of self-appointed police
Yeah.
that, and it was always, quite frankly, and I consider myself a proud progressive, but people never got canceled for being too progressive. And it felt very unhealthy. And then we'll comment on that, and then I'm going to play identity politics and just make some anecdotal observations in the classroom and see if there's any actual data that supports my thesis. But talk about how all of a sudden, do you think some of it is, I just saw it as people who weren't adding any actual value and were trying to find some merit and grab virtue or some sort of relevance, and saw this as an easy way to try and grab status, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things going on at once. I think a lot of younger people were taught. Well, one thing from my work with Jonathan Haidt, one chapter we ended up leaving out because I just didn't have enough research to back it up, was my intuition that a lot of the phenomena we were seeing seemed to be playing out some of the values of the circa 2010 anti-bullying movement. So in coddling, we talk about there being three great untruths, which are basically terrible advice to give someone that's inconsistent with either modern psychology or ancient wisdom, and that will make you more miserable if you believe them. And so we give this negative advice as what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, kind of like the opposite of Nietzsche. The second one is always trust your feelings, which sounds nice, but is just awful advice. And three, life is a battle between good people and evil people, which is contrary to more sophisticated understanding of that everybody has some aspect of good and evil within them, which is more how I was raised. There was a critic who pointed out, after coddling came out in 2018, that these were more or less kind of like the way anti-bullying was being taught after sort of like a moral panic about it. Not that bullying isn't real and should be addressed, but things manifest in their own ways. And this was primarily due to parents being aware of more of this stuff due to the fact that they could see it on their cell phones, they could see it on their screens. And this did have an emphasis of, human fragility. If you feel that you've been wronged, and that there's basically only two types of people: good people and evil people. Good people, victims and bullies. And I think that this wasn't the only cause by any stretch of the imagination, but to explain why I think young people had such sympathy for this movement, I think they were framing it partially in that way. But unfortunately, because the rule of human behavior is that all motives are mixed, it also met with something that my very young colleague and co-author on Canceling the American Mind was able to point out, that she was part of the first generation of people to grow up with cell phones in her pocket. She had them since she was 10. In junior high school, it took on very much the nature of what you would expect. A mass communication device given to kids in junior high school, it became a way of showing aggression against your perceived enemies, but doing it within the rules of the time, which you don't call out someone for being unpopular or ugly, you call them out for being something more that allows you to feel more moral. So I think these two mixed motives kind of came together for the students. When it comes to the utterly crucial role, though, of the administrators, because this one, if administrators looked at this and went, "No way, no, 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 you're not getting a professor fired because you don't like what they said," this would have died in the crib. But they had met those same administrators we've been fighting against at Fire Forever, and together it created this kind of calamity, for freedom of speech, where these people who already believed it was their job to say what shall be orthodox on this particular campus met a cohort of students that were more willing to play along with that too. And again, as with all things, with mixed motives.
You said something that I thought was so, I don't know, puncturing. You said that students are being taught the mental habits of anxious and depressed people, which really struck me. I thought, we're we're teaching the kids to be fragile and actually make them less resilient. It's more than just word. I have seen this evolution where kids in my class, they feel weaker. It's not just a cool virtue thing and trendy or fashionable. They appear to me to be less resilient. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole project with me and John came out of my observation when I was dealing with my own anxiety and depression, and cognitive behavioral therapy is what saved me and utterly transformed my life, which is a process by which you develop all these tools and sort of talking back to the exaggerated voices in your head, that tell you things like you're doomed or you're a failure or nobody loves you. All of these kind of voices that, to a degree, to be clear, everybody except sociopaths have. But when you're anxious and depressed, they're louder and they're harder to ignore. The amazing thing about CBT is it teaches you that if you actually rationally, not power of positive thinking stuff, but just rationally interrogate these, you realize you're overgeneralizing or engaging in fortune telling, that you know what the future is going to look like, or mind reading, all these things that logically don't really stand up to scrutiny. And the observation that really brought me to talk to John about a potential collaboration, although actually I just told him the idea that I thought was cool. I didn't actually think we'd collaborate on it. That was a dream come true. Was just that it was like we were teaching kids reverse CBT. That we were teaching them, do overgeneralize, do catastrophize, do engage in binary thinking, do believe you know the future, and and it comes from, I believe, two different places. One, a very well-meaning idea from both parents and administrators all through K through PhD, to sort of, and an instinct to sort of protect young people and to insulate them from harm. But then a less admirable quality is that essentially, if you make people feel guilty or frightened, it in theory will motivate them towards political action that you prefer. And to me, That's the one that makes me pretty angry. The first one makes me kind of sad because it's like, yeah, no, it's an understandable instinct, but it's still terrible advice, and you should have known that. The second one is the idea that we can sort of guilt, shame, anger, upset through telling people that they are more fragile than they are, that they are in greater danger than they are, that will somehow result in a better world. And I always make the point, listen, this is a bad calculation, even just rationally, because people who are filled with despair and anxiety don't always choose, to say the least, the best course of action to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, I want to make some observations, anecdotal, and you tell me if there's any data to back it up. In terms of, I think I'm trying to think of that product. Was it called Jotform, where all of a sudden someone would get upset by something and spin up an online petition, and within a certain amount of time, everybody thought it was cool to join in, and the dean had to deal with this bullshit. And I do think a lot of it was bullshit. But a couple observations, and you tell me if they nullify or validate them. I would never got in the way, or I was never subject to this sort of scrutiny or blowback, because the first thing I say in class, one, I'm known as being provocative and quite frankly, a little bit aggressive and obnoxious. So the expectation is there.
Yeah.
And the first thing I say is, if you think there's a non-zero probability, something I say is going to trigger you. I curse, I make sexist jokes, I have certain unconscious biases I'm still working on.
Yeah.
But if you think something's really going to emotionally trigger you, you should call your parents and tell them to come get you because you're not ready for college.
Yeah.
So there's a certain expectation that I'm going to be a little bit out there. And no one ever has, I've never gotten run over by this. I have some colleagues who are much more thoughtful and considerate than me, 99.9% of the time. And then they make an error. They're inarticulate around something. And it's shocking because they're known as these nice, benign people. And then they get taken, they get taken out and shot, because it's almost like those of us who are a little bit more aggressive and provocative regularly are not subject to the same scrutiny as someone who makes one false move. And then the second observation I would make, and this is identity politics, but I'm going to do it anyways. The people I have observed in class who get really upset, I mean, physically upset, they're not faking it tend to be women, tend to be white women.
Upper class white women, yes.
What's the data there?
The data on women, particularly white women, and particularly upper class white women, being more free speech skeptical is just very apparent. And that's one of those things that, it makes me a little uncomfortable to say it, but it's a consistent finding. And it's something that we found among the professorate, among students as well. And of course, I think the free speech skepticism comes from a good place, but so does all of censorship. So I don't think that that's um, a strange observation. The observation that the professors who start out more sympathetic tend to be more vulnerable definitely accords with my professional experience. That it certainly seems that way, but then there's also a category of sort of outspoken conservative or outspoken, iconoclastic professors that I've definitely seen get targeted quite aggressively over the years. So in some ways, I will say that some of your observations come a little bit from luck, because like you get one student or one administrator who decides, I'm getting Scott Galloway, and the whole dynamic changes.
We'll be right back after a quick break. What are your thoughts on how the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn handled that situation, and generally assess their response, Congress's or the congressional committee's viewpoint on this, and this is a difficult one. And what is the line between free speech and hate speech from people in masks that creates an environment that's unhealthy for the community?
There have been critics who have been really critical of those professors when they went to the anti-Semitism hearing in December of 2023. There have been people who've been primarily critical of the fact that when asked if calling for genocide was protected or not on their campus, they said it depends on context. Now, here's the truth. It does depend on context. In First Amendment law, if you're saying something, and particularly in academically, if you're saying something theoretically, if you're saying something in the course of a philosophical discussion, that is different than being like, I'm going to kill you. So context is right. But the reason why I nonetheless have zero sympathy, actually, to be fair, I have sympathy for the president of MIT, because MIT has not been the best, but it sure as hell has
Yeah.
not been the worst. Penn and Harvard, Claudine Gay, I had no sympathy for them at all, because the reason why I have no sympathy for them is they'd been utterly terrible on freedom of speech prior to that point. And definitely your critics, including people like Barry Weiss, have a good point that saying these people who claim to be exquisitely sensitive about fat phobia, is the example that she usually uses, were suddenly not caring if someone said something that sounded an awful lot like your country should be wiped off the map. So what is the line? The line, as far as fire is concerned, and we think to a large degree the law is something that actually crosses the line into anti-Semitic or racial or sexual harassment. And that's not as simple as just saying something offensive. Actually, it can't just be saying something offensive, which, by the way, I think is absolutely the right rule. I think the situation for free speech would be even worse if it than it currently is if we didn't have that bedrock principle, which is called in the law. It has to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior directed at somebody for it to be harassment. But a lot of what we saw on campus after October 7th, you don't even have to get to that question. A lot of what we saw was, violent attempts to intimidate, actual threats, in some cases, physical assault, taking over of buildings, all of these things that are just not protected, nor should they be. And particularly, and this is something that I just did a TED talk, and the thing that I probably angered some people by opening up with this example, but I want to be really clear here. There was a speech, for example, at Berkeley. There was an Israeli Defense Force speaker there, and students organized and it's nice to have this actually like in a screenshot of a tweet of a text message to everybody. Shut it down. And 200 students stormed where the guy was supposed to speak. Broke down a door, broke down a window, and chased the guy off. And I always have to explain, okay, that's mob censorship. Like that is an attempt by people to say, 200 people to say to anybody who would want to hear this person, you're not allowed to hear this person because I don't approve of them. That's not okay. That's the kind of thing that, in my opinion, should get you kicked out of a university, because it means you're not actually understanding the point of a university. And one of the reasons why this angered some people is because I also tend to point out that from October 7th on, all but about three, and the two worst years for deplatforming involving violence and involving shout downs, as they're called, um, all but three were pro-Palestinian activists. So like it was one of these things. We're spending plenty of time defending the free speech rights of pro-Palestinian students, pro-Palestinian professors, but nonetheless, we were also seeing these same students and who expected to be protected by freedom of speech showing no respect whatsoever for the free speech of others. So a lot of these issues are actually not that hard. The hardest issue you get into is essentially if it's not a threat, if it's not blocking someone from getting from point A to point B, it's just really, really offensive. At what point does that actually become anti-Semitic or racial or ethnic harassment? And the answer is essentially that Davis test that we always refer to at FIRE, which is it severe, persistent, and pervasive, such that it causes a reasonable person to be denied effectively an education. So that's a high standard, but it should be if you're dealing with something that has an offense aspect in it. But again, for a lot of these situations, you didn't even have to get to that analysis because what the students were doing wasn't protected in the first place.
So I'm asking this to learn, not to make a statement, but I feel like anonymity has been conflated with free speech to our detriment. That some of the really vile things you see online, you know, I understand how important it is for individuals to have First Amendment and free speech rights, but I don't think that applies to bots. And I think that an understandable protection for anonymity has morphed into a total lack of accountability and a real coarsening of our discourse online. And I think it extends into letting government agencies wear masks and things like that. But I'm curious, I'd love to just get your thoughts on the fulcrum between the importance of people having the right to say things anonymously because what they're saying could trigger danger or self-harm or harm for them. And at the same time, how this reverence for anonymity may have gone too far and resulted in a lack of accountability and some really ugly shit spreading online. Your thoughts, Greg?
Well, in terms of First Amendment law, anonymous speech is protected, but I don't think that's sufficient enough of an answer. And I tend to think of the justification for anonymity as like a seesaw. That essentially, if we lived in a free and enlightened society in which people welcomed dissent and welcomed disagreement, and there was no imaginable idea that you'd be punished for it, then the justification for anonymity would kind of fall on ring hollow to people. They'd be like, "Who cares?" But we don't live in that world, and we live less in that world than we used to. Because even I'd say 10 years ago, before or 12 years ago, before cancel culture, the idea of saying something that was your genuinely held opinion had a much lower likelihood of ruining your career. Add to it the possibility of being actually punished, in some way. Now, that certainly applies to now, to a much larger degree than I ever thought I'd see, to say a lot of countries in Western Europe at this point, a lot of countries in the Anglosphere. I mean, by different estimates, they're arresting something like 30 people a day for offense speech in Britain. I've heard different accounts, but generally they go between 7 and 40 people being arrested a day for that. Germany, like that will brag about the fact that they did morning raid. They did this on 60 Minutes, is what brag about doing morning raids on someone who called a politician a penis. Under that situation, the justification for having anonymous speech goes way up. Can it and is it abused? Absolutely. But so, I think actually I'm going to quote Milton Friedman here, but it's just a really good quote. Something isn't a right unless it can be abused.
I like that. What about so Section 230, the idea that these nascent platforms aren't subject to the same kind of libel, slander, disparagement laws that traditional media platforms. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we toy with Section 30 to our great peril. Like democracy, it's the worst of any system except all the others. Now, to be clear, there might be some other system that I haven't thought of that could be better. But when it comes to things, but I do find it particularly almost amusing that conservatives are going after 230, or were going after 230 with such gusto. Because if you actually, even let's just take it to the defamation protections that 230 gives to ISPs, to internet service providers. If suddenly that were to vanish, it would lead to internet service providers censoring a lot more, like a lot more, because they can be held liable for libel, for defamation. And I think that given the biases in a lot of social media companies, that would wildly disproportionately affect what conservatives say. So I think that 230 is probably, I think that overall we benefit so much from 230. Of course, it's going to have downsides, but I'm more afraid of monkeying with it.
But you don't see an issue that traditional media platforms, which are struggling to stay viable and raise the funds to do fact checking and put out, I don't want to say the truth, but a greater attempt to do the good work of journalism and fact check and do their research. You don't see that a problem with holding traditional media to an entirely different standard, a higher standard than these online platforms?
Yeah, and that's generally the way they're held. That essentially traditional media that's responsible for the content that they produce. I think it makes more sense to hold them liable for not doing the sufficient fact checking for defamation, as opposed to something that hosts everything. So, I mean, something that hosts the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and everything, and YouTube, and everything else under the sun, is something that's quite distinct than just the New York Times by itself.
Do you think there's opportunity for nuance or gray area? And I'll propose a solution, or what I think we should think about. I think about 230 a lot. The idea that people can break through and say things and post something, and that a company that creates a lot of economic value, lets a lot of interesting opinions, when sometimes the conspiracy view ends up being actually more true than you think. There's been some just wonderful things about these platforms and the ability for viewpoints and consumers or content producers to kind of go direct to consumer and kind of have at it. At the same time, um, I I worry that the protection is not consistent in the sense that, well, let me propose a solution. So if my co-host on one of my podcasts, Raging Moderates, and she's the kind of the sole Democrat on this show, which is actually the most watched show on cable news, called The Five. Someone got upset that she called out Ken Paxton or something and mocked up a picture of her with her previous boyfriend, and has gone into this tried and true misogynistic slut shaming, misinformation, having an affair from her first husband, hasn't been married to. I mean, just total nonsense, right? And the algorithm on Twitter loves that because it creates a lot of comments, a lot of engagement, people weighing in, conspiracy theorists, and also people protecting her. Creates more Nissan ads. And the algorithm itself from Twitter is trained to elevate that content and give it broader and further reach than it would organically because it creates Nissan ads. In other words, there's an economic incentive to spread disinformation. Do you think there's a solution or some gray area where maybe we say, okay, you're a bulletin board and you can't be responsible. It's unrealistic, suppression of speech, economic impairment if you were responsible for policing everything someone pins up on the board. But if you as a social media company decide to elevate algorithmically content and give it more spread than it might organically, at that point, are you really different than an editor at CNBC or MSNBC or at Fox who's subject to a different set of standards? Shouldn't they be subject to the same standards if they make the conscious decision to algorithmically elevate content?
I'm always worried about the distortive impact of government, also regulation, sometimes of, and liability. And so I'm very hesitant to change anything without. And my job is to make the argument for, err on the side of free speech as much as possible, and err on the side of as little, as few things being banned and as few things being government regulated as possible. So my fear is that essentially, if you started having government entanglement with algorithmic choices, you really got to decide, one, which government do you trust? Do you trust Biden to do that? Do you trust Trump to do that? But also, particularly when it's a liability standpoint, how distortive that actually can be to what gets reported in the first place. Because this is, in a sense, kind of like why everybody sues for libel in Britain. Even though they've made slight improvements around the edges, it's still much easier to find people guilty of committing libel in Britain than it is in the United States. We actually have a shield for the country, basically saying, providing some modicum of protection for people in the U.S. from libel tourism that takes place takes place in the UK. So, I'm always going to be fairly skeptical of that kind of stuff, but it's also my societal role to be skeptical of that kind of stuff.
We'll be right back. So I want to throw the most difficult stuff at you and get your thoughts.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I appreciate it.
So if I were Putin and I'd lost 1 million men to a war and spending, $70 to $100 billion a year on a losing war, and at some point, if this war continued to wreak the kind of economic and human damage, if it were to continue to do that, at some point, I might find myself falling out of a window.
Yeah.
So I think he would be stupid not to weaponize and spin up troll farms in Albania and then create a list of the 10,000 most influential people online who are pro-Ukraine and start attacking their reputation with millions of bots.
Isn't he already doing that, though?
Well, yeah, I think he is.
Yeah.
And that's my question. And that is, do bots have First Amendment rights, and do these platforms have some sort of obligation, which I think would only be registered or adhered to through some sort of regulation, to protect us against bad actors that might be, quite frankly, raising a generation of military, civic, and nonprofit leaders who don't like America or begin to have their views shaped and ultimately our votes and our military decisions shaped on outside forces that are taking advantage of a very porous and lightly regulated tech ecosystem and platforms. Your thoughts?
The question of whether or not bots have First Amendment rights, of course they don't. But do bot creators have First Amendment rights? At least when they're in the United States, absolutely certainly they do. When you're talking about the kind of propaganda, kind of warfare and targeting that is possible in the age of the internet, in the age of social media, when you kind of fall down this rabbit hole of how you actually address it without actually devastating, without having huge government encroachment, which will end in bad places as well, or without creating massive unintended consequences. The best way to do this historically has simply to have authorities that people actually trust. And we have blown giant holes in the only thing that really can protect you from disinformation and misinformation. And you have to start figuring out ways to get authorities that people essentially trust, because one of the ways we could potentially address some of this stuff is by having institutions pointing out what is troll farms and what isn't. But under the current environment, there's going to be a lot of like, sure they are. You just don't like what they're saying is going to be the response there. And in a situation where these institutions had better societal trust, they'd be like, oh my God, you're right.
So you're a First Amendment attorney. What are we not paying attention to in the courts? Have there been any legal decisions that you think are especially important to the future of First Amendment or speech or its regulation or lack thereof? What have you seen come down the pike that you think has not gotten enough attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think it got good attention, but I think people haven't thought through all the ramifications of it. And this gets to your point on anonymity, where we may disagree to some degree. But the change in the law to say that you can actually require verification for kids, and actually for really for anybody to use porn sites in Texas, uh, is a case that could really have some serious bad ramifications, um, unless it stays relatively cabined. Now, I was definitely among the First Amendment people saying, listen, there's a case called New York v. Ginsburg from the late 1960s that says you can require store owners to put the nudie mags on the back shelves, and to make sure that minors don't get them. But then we had decade after decade of the Supreme Court and other courts basically saying, but online, that can't possibly apply for all sorts of, and to be clear, very serious reasons. I knew that wouldn't last forever. And then eventually, Texas passed a verification regime that was actually more complex than I originally understood, but was first marketed as something where you had to basically show like a driver's license if you want to see porn. And that would also include that they had to have disclaimers saying that porn is harmful to your mental health and all this kind of stuff, which it has compelled speech issues. I think they made some efforts to sort of improve the law, make it clear that there's other ways to verify. Anyway, if that stays, so that fight was something that I predicted we were going to lose in the Paxson case. Um, Now here's the question: are we then going to, with the best of intentions, create an environment where you essentially can't use the internet without identifying yourself in some way? And that scares me, because I do actually think that the situation for free speech, even in the so-called free world, is dodgier than it's ever been in my lifetime. And the idea that at this precise moment, we'd also make it harder for people to hide what they're looking at or what they're reading, scares me. So our efforts at Fire are definitely going to be to make sure that that decision, as much as possible, stays cabined to kids' access to adult materials.
Do I think the platforms are already doing that? Do the platforms already know exactly what we're doing, saying, and when? But as long as they use it to monetize advertising, it seems to be there's a tolerance for it. I think the cat's already out of the bag. I think they already know everything we do and what we say. We don't seem that worried about that. But then we have this, do we have this tremendous fidelity for protecting them when it comes to any, forward facing viewpoints that might result in more I don't know, just more. It seems like we're just protecting them in the wrong areas and not looking at them in others. I apologize for the word salad there, Greg. Do you see any inconsistency?
Yeah, no, I definitely get the concern, but I do think that there are tools that people badly underutilize.
Well, they're purposely made complicated to utilize. If you tried to regulate your kids' content on Meta, I mean, they are not. I would argue they are not readily accessible purposefully,
Yeah.
or they're not easily used.
Yeah, no, I definitely asked for help to make with my kids stuff. But now we have Signal, for example, we do DuckDuckGo. There are some basic steps you can do to somewhat protect your privacy. And of course, when it comes to private corporations doing bad things, and this is something that I feel like we have an entire generation of young Americans sort of brainwashed to believe that you should be more afraid of corporations than you should be of governments. And I just think that's absolute nonsense, particularly foreign governments, but also, frankly, the U.S. government, and that corporations, and people talk about that evil profit motive, and I'm kind of like, I prefer the profit motive to a lot of the other motives you can have for finding this stuff out. And profit motive often lends itself to, and by the way, we protect our users' privacy in a way that the Chinese, the CCP, or Russia, or even our own government is like, no, we want this information for other reasons.
So just so you know, just I'm very good at turning this podcast into it's really just an excuse for me to talk about me. Steve Bannon suggested that the administration sue me for some of the things I've said about him. I called him a rapist. And do you feel that the president is in different ways trying to suppress free speech, and if and what laws, or what do you think should be done about it? What are your views on it? Feels to me like free speech has been chilled
Oh
from
yeah.
the administration.
Oh
And I'm
God, yeah,
just
absolutely.
curious to get your thoughts on it. It sounds like you agree with it, but what can and should be done to push back on that?
So the ways in which it's being chilled, just really quickly, there's been attacks on mainstream media. People can argue that it's deserved, but that doesn't mean you get to violate the First Amendment. There's attacks on higher education. Again, you can feel like it's deserved, but it doesn't mean you get to violate the First Amendment or existing laws. And then there's the attack on the law firms, which probably is the one that I think gets the least attention, but probably scares me the most. Now, when it comes to the media, for example, like we're the group defending Ann Selzer. Ann Selzer is the pollster in Iowa who got the poll really wrong right before the election, having Kamala up by 2 points in Iowa. But when it came out, she apologized. She explained how she got it wrong, saying that she was using methodology that was really effective maybe 10 years ago, but has gotten increasingly ineffective. As fewer people have landlines and that kind of stuff, because she used to be considered like the gold standard of pollsters. But she was nonetheless sued by Trump himself. Actually, this is before inauguration day for under a Consumer Protection Act in Iowa. And the Consumer Protection Act was really designed for preventing false advertising, like as in commercial speech, saying that these pills will help you lose 40 pounds a day type things, not getting a poll wrong, which is good faith reporting. So we're defending her in that case. Then there's also like the 60 Minutes situation, the ABC News. The 60 Minutes one I think of as particularly bad because it really seemed like the administration was dangling a proposed merger
Yeah, that's right.
with
Skydance,
Skydance,
about
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
in front of CBS, is saying, kind of implying we're not going to agree to this unless you play ball, which is good. The university stuff, nobody's been a bigger critic of Harvard, for example, than I've been. They have finished dead last in our campus free speech rankings, one of the best and most data intensive things that FIRE does, or like the most data intensive thing that FIRE does. And Harvard was dead last 2 years in a row. But we're currently defending Harvard because the letter the administration sent to Harvard was basically saying, because you're probably in violation of Title VI, which they may be, and Title VII, which when it comes to admissions probably are, that we essentially have to nationalize Harvard. Like basically, the government gets to decide all of the key things about what Harvard would decide on its own, which is not a power the government's been granted. And when it comes to the law firms, I mean, like that's the one that I wrote on this in my Substack, The Eternally Radical Idea, about all of these cases. And it started with them just going after attorneys who would oppose the Trump administration, even like people like Robert Mueller, and where they had law firms and saying that they would be denied their Secret Service protection, not Secret Service, their not Secret Service, their
Repackage violence. If you're someone who ordered a strike on Suleiman, the head of the Iranian security forces, and you take away a general's security detail, you are putting that person in harm's way, in my view.
and get rid of their security clearance, and then also deny them access to federal buildings, which of course include courtrooms. And that's to me like some of the most chilling stuff. Now, what can be done about it? The thing that's happening consistently is that Trump is losing in court, and so far he's mostly been abiding by those rulings. I'm a little bit concerned, given how fast and loose sometimes this administration plays with the rules, that might not hold up if when push really comes to shove. But fingers crossed. In terms of like what else people can do about it, I think it really is a question of what happens in the next in the midterms, and then of course in the presidential election. But it's troubling, but not unexpected.
Yeah, shocking, but not surprising. Just as we wrap up here, Greg, a lot of young men listen to this podcast based on some of the many challenges all young people, but especially I would argue some young men in our society are facing right now. A lot of them are struggling with their own mental health. And I appreciate how transparent and vulnerable you were at the beginning of the podcast talking about your own struggles. And you had said that cognitive behavioral therapy really helped you. Can you share some thoughts on your struggles with your own anxiety and depression and any advice you might have for young people who are facing their own challenges?
Sure. And that's and it's tough because like everyone struggles kind of differently. And I really understand people's kind of concern about, well, one, of course, the expense of getting a therapist, but also the fear that given that therapy has to some degree become politicized, that they don't want to end up with someone with a therapist who's going to judge them, for in some cases just for being a male or for having non-conforming political views. So I get all of that, but I did hear from one friend about their kid who basically said he didn't need therapy because he watches a lot of podcasts. And he's on YouTube a lot getting advice, and it's just not the same thing.
Yeah, that's not the fix.
Yeah. So there's people out there like Camilo Ortiz, sorry, who is trying to put together apolitical therapists, who or ones who won't judge you, who won't let their political opinion interfere with their therapy, which is amazing that you have to do that, but you do, unfortunately. And within so looking for people who are recommended that way for CBT. There's also some approaches to CBT that actually lend themselves fairly well to even apps, which is I don't think it's sufficient, but it can help. But here's the thing: unless you make it when John and I were writing Coddling, I kept on sort of like changing language back because John was talking about how simple CBT was, and I'm like or easy. I think maybe was like a word they use. I'm like, listen, it may be simple, but it's not easy because you have to do it several times a day. You have to actually do it when those self-hating voices come up in your head, those catastrophizing voices. Otherwise, your brain will never get in the habit of talking back to those, and you have to do it every time they come up, and you have to do it for like I would say probably you're not really going to see much change for the first 6 months even. But I remember about 9 months in, suddenly being like, wait a second, all these things that used to pop up in my head, they don't sound convincing anymore, and it was really dramatic after that. So I definitely believe look into CBT. I think that, one thing that I do a lot when I'm having a hard time is I go reread Seneca's Letters to a Young Man. I find that they're really approachable. Meditation is very helpful to people. But don't forget things exercise is really key. And if you're in it, there is something there. My favorite book is Upward Spiral by Alex Korb. I highly recommend. I have like a whole thing. I have a whole like a Substack on this very issue because it's I get asked it so much, and I give kind of all of my advice.
And what's that Substack called, or what's that post called?
Well, I don't remember what the post is called, but my Substack is the eternally radical idea. But also, talk to people about it. Talk to friends. When you're in a really bad way, there's a sense that nobody's going to want to hear your whining about it, but that's just not true. And in most cases, because as hard as it may be to believe sometimes, when you're really deep down and dark, there are people out there who love you.
Greg Lukianoff is a free speech advocate, First Amendment attorney, president of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, which has probably had more impact on my parenting than any book I have read. And also The Canceling of the American Mind. His latest book, War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail, is out next week. He joins us from Maine. Greg, I wanted to meet you and speak to you for a couple of years because one of my role models, Jonathan Haidt, whenever he talks about you, he speaks about you in such reverence and with such respect. So I was really excited to have this conversation. Very much appreciate your time. Also very much appreciate what you said at the end about cognitive behavioral therapy. And the takeaway I have, and that I hope people take away from this podcast, is when you're really down and you think everyone's sick of you and sick of hearing from you and doesn't have time for you, that's just not true. So anyways, thank you for sharing that, Greg.